Welcome to this final session of the 8th iteration of the Vienna Humanities Festival. My name is Leonard Benardo. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce Victor and Hannah just a second, but a public service announcement. If you need headphones because of the English language or to hear better, do it right now. They're available for free, right in the back. Okay, so it's a great honor to be with VICTOR BLÜML and HANNAH ZEAVIN to discuss the psychological consequences of the multiple crises that have been enveloping all of us around the world. The kind of dread and dystopia that we have confronted over these last years. But it's not just the consequences that we're going to discuss, but also psychological concepts and frames of reference that will enable us to get purchase on this so-called polycrisis. We've heard over the last 2 days at the Vienna Humanities Festival about sociology, literature, history, politics. I think ending with psychology will allow us to end with a bang and not just a historical whimper. So VICTOR BLÜML, who's now a good friend, we've known each other fewer than 24 hours. Victor is a Viennese-based practicing psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Studied medicine and philosophy in both Vienna and Paris, and is an associate professor at the Medical University of Vienna in the Department of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. HANNAH ZEAVIN, a proud card-carrying Brooklyn native, is now a professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, scholar, a writer, an editor, whose work focuses on the history of the human sciences, technology, and media, and someone I've known for more than 24 hours. So it's great to be here with both of you, and I'm wondering, I don't know if the Unbehagen concept, that is the master category, I think, for this 8th iteration, has been effectively unpacked. The great 1930 short book, Civilization and Its Discontents, Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, is of course where this concept, this term, has been taken from. And I'm wondering to what extent Unbehagen, as a psychological concept, is effective and appropriate for the kinds of issues we're here to discuss. So maybe, Hannah, if you want to lead off on the notion of the Unbehagen.
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me, and this is really wonderful. It's been so nice to also get to know you across the last 24 hours. Unbehagen is being translated as on edge, and I find that really interesting, in part because of the Freud, and we can talk a little bit about civilization and its discontents, but I was looking at the translation history of how it becomes understood as discontent. And there was apparently a huge debate, maybe more than any other Freud term except for like ego and ich, which is notorious, where Freud, when he was having it first translated into English, really didn't like the idea of discontents being the term, and instead proposed, and his second translator proposed, malaise. This kind of like low-level, generalized unwellness. Whereas in English, especially American English, discontent sort of is pre-revolt. And Freud is very much thinking about a kind of what does it mean to be under attack and in conflict with society. But it's also more than, in a way, on edge. On edge, I feel like, is vibratorily anxious. So we can propose discontent, on edge, malaise, as this kind of triad of words that don't quite capture the German sense of Unbehagen, but are well on their way.
Victor, your thoughts on the Unbehagen translation is malaise, the French term, disquiet, on edge. What works for you here?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and it was great getting to know you over the past day. Well, the Unbehagen, actually, I did not so much think about the translation issues, actually, but taking it up, I think what Freud actually was concerned with, the Unbehagen is something a bit, I don't know, fuzzy, you said, and something you can't quite grasp, some feeling of apprehension, of uneasiness, an anxiety, which is not really clear where it's coming from. And so I think it's a very, I like the kind of the ambiguity of the term, which captures something of what it wants to describe, actually. Unbehagen is not a psychoanalytic core concept. Actually, Freud never uses it in a specific sense. It's really, he used it for this. It got famous because of this little book, but it has a certain ambiguous quality which I think fits the current state of affairs, which, of course, every generation kind of, it's been rewritten a lot of times, always the question of the current Unbehagen in the current society, in the current culture. But I think it really captures something of a present state of anxiety, diffuse uneasiness, nervousness, where you can't really get your foot on where it's coming from. And so I like that about the term.
So Hannah, you are a strong devotee of civilization and its discontents.
I really like the short book, as we're calling it. I like that we're calling it the short book, in part because it's one of Freud's first, Freud died in 1939 in London, and so the book was published technically in 29, bearing the date of 30, written in that year. And so across the last 10 years of Freud's life, he really turned to kind of metapsychology, as we would call it in English, for the first time, and tried to move from 27, Future of the Illusion, thinking about religion, in part born out from a debate that was centered on the revolts that, I don't need to probably tell this audience, happened here in 1927 in July, as there's a kind of return to fascism, and Wilhelm Reich and Freud have a debate, then this book, and then Moses and monotheism. So I like all those books.
let's just make sure, Future of an Illusion, the 27 book, is Freud's condemnation of religion. He was a devout atheist.
A devout atheist is a great oxymoron that perfectly fits Freud.
But in terms of the 1930 book, Civilization and Its Discontents, how does that play into, if you will, the current crisis, the kind of desire for individuality within the expectations of society? How do you see that tension playing out today?
I mean, I'll give one quote from it. I mean, I think there are many different things in that book. This from the 5th chapter, I believe, Freud. It goes without saying that a civilization which leaves so large a number of its participants unsatisfied and drives them into revolt neither has nor deserves the prospect of a lasting existence. And I think that, when we're thinking about on edge and we're thinking about the kind of, you're using the term polycrisis, or others might offer like conjuncture, right? One thing we see is just widespread, so many different types of malaise on its way to or already in revolt, so many kinds of suffering, total war and, absolute economic inequality and so on. And I think Freud is addressing another moment where that is nigh, 1929, 1930. The picture is already being painted, although still somewhat far away in Vienna, but certainly not already in Berlin, right? The time is then. And he's trying to understand it. and how individuals come into collective pain under society and why societies are kind of disciplining against, the deeper drives of individuals. And that's what he's interested in. And I think we should be again.
So I'm wondering, Victor, if we can just take a current social malady that we find in many geographies, that of polarization. One of, not a student of Freud, but someone who knew Freud, the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, spent years in Budapest and London, lived here. How would Melanie Klein think in terms of her approach, not just to small children, but generally? How would she contend with the notion of polarization from a psychological viewpoint?
I'll come to that in a second, maybe taking a bridge, picking up some aspects of what you were referring to in the civilization and its discontents, because Melanie Klein was actually one of the students of Freud, or followers of Freud, you could say, who took some of his aspects maybe more seriously than many other analysts of the following generation. And there was specifically what Freud actually was, you were talking about the deep drives that are actually what's troubling in civilization and its discontents. Actually, what Freud was pointing to, the last cause of the growing discontent in civilization and its discontents, is the innate human destructiveness, which he called the death drive, famously. And that is the deepest sense of instability and uneasiness, that there's the problem of aggression and destructivity, human destructivity, was really on Freud's mind in the last 10 or 15 years of his life, after 1920 actually. And Melanie Klein was one of, as I said, was the analyst who maybe took that most seriously, the problem of human aggression, destructivity. And she was in general very much concerned with the most primitive forms of mental functioning, as you could say. She worked with little children, but also with severely disturbed patients, psychotic patients. And there she found very, very primitive psychological mechanisms at work, how they dealt with often unbearable mental states, with unbearable affects, feelings. And the two most prominent mechanisms that Melanie Klein discovered, but many others also described in some way, were splitting and projection, actually. So when we talk about polarization in society, you could say, where it's often, it describes something where you got two very separate places that are in no connection to each other. The one is good, the other one is bad. It's an us and them rhetoric and a framing of what's going on in very sharp, divided terms. And that's what she'd call psychologically, it's where splitting predominates, where you've got on the one hand idealized, only good, perfect figures, and on the other hand you got devalued, dehumanized, persecutory figures. And there is it's a state of war and non-communication between these two parts.
And you're no longer even able to visualize the other.
Definitely, that comes together. To put it a bit, it's of course an oversimplification, but you could say it very much distorts the apprehension of reality. You could say it's a black and white world with no gray, no nuanced and integrated vision of actual happenings, but it's a very split and fragmented way to see the world.
You know, especially in the US, I'm curious whether this translates to other geographies. People have started to use PTSD as part of the vernacular, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is its own medical malady. People use it now in a commonplace way. We were joking yesterday, the soup I had for dinner was terrible. I have PTSD from it. It's taking a very serious concept and trivializing it. I'd like to talk, though, about trauma for a second as it relates to COVID and as it relates to the climate crisis. For some people, the use of trauma and the use of denial for what was experienced during the years of COVID and what we're currently experiencing in the context of the climate catastrophe, for some people, that's an exaggeration. To use trauma is to put too serious a term of art, a psychological term of art, on a particular condition. Do you see it as an exaggeration when we think about the consequences of COVID or the potential catastrophic civilizational consequences of the climate catastrophe?
Well, one thing that's intense about trauma as a concept is, and this is certainly true in the US, as you're gesturing at, it's become really promiscuous. It's supposed to apply, yes, to the bad soup, but also to the bad breakup. And there's a long and complicated reason why people want to take on the idea of trauma. And I think that's the place to start, because you've introduced the fact that it's been blown out, which is in the US that trauma has become associated to a kind of perfect victimhood, right? The thing has happened to me, and I have not taken part in it. It's a unidirectional thing. And of course, there are traumas, and things have happened to individuals and to groups where systems and individual actors in them have perpetrated, no doubt. With COVID-19 in the US, which was experienced as a deeply classed and raced phenomenon, like thinking about historians of medicine saying that COVID-19 is an X-ray to society. Any pre-existing condition is going to be heightened, augmented. The people who are already most marginalized are going to be the most impacted. Of course there is trauma there, right? It's a mass death event. I think denial, the denial that happened is where we could go with both these things. But at the same time, there is this interest in registering bad things that happen as being per se not my fault. And trauma has become that concept in the US for really particular historical reasons, having to do with the forever wars in the United States and the military psychiatry, right, which is the home of PTSD, the originator of that concept, which would take us too long to get into. But trauma is fundamentally, I'll just end here, like an individual concept. And so the question is, was an individual traumatized? Only they could tell me. But I think we do see mass trauma, widespread trauma, because many individuals and communities experience something that literally blew out the synapses of registration, and that's what trauma means. Not something really, really bad, but actually something that exceeds our capacity to understand, to know, to metabolize, to look at, and often comes belatedly, right? Isn't known in the present. And of course, we're having a conversation about the present, and even just a few years after the pandemic, we can start to see it because it re-arrives, right? Always belatedly with trauma.
So Victor, Hannah was saying that at its base, trauma is an individual concept, yet has collective consequences. Is there a notion of collective trauma as it pertains, say, to COVID, to climate, to other disasters?
Well, maybe that's a good occasion to say something about the difficulties when you talk about. I'm a clinician and a researcher, but I mean I'm an analyst and a psychiatrist, and we always have the difficulty. We are very much focused on our individual patients, and most of our concepts derive from individual therapy. So it is always a bit difficult to really make this transposition when using concepts deriving from individual psychology to collective phenomena. So you got to be careful in a way, and it's often a slippery slope sometimes. But on the other hand, it's necessary and it can be enlightening. Freud famously said that individual psychology is social psychology, always also social psychology. It cannot be separated from each other, so I think that's very important. But it is methodologically, it is difficult, and I agree with you that the trauma has, first and foremost, it describes something on an individual level, and as analysts we are very much occupied, or our task is to deal with the specific ways an individual is handling an unbearable situation. But I do think there is a sufficient reason to talk about collective traumas as well, that there is, in a way, that societies, that there is a too muchness of the crises that are going on, that it's kind of, it's too much for the capacities of a society to handle a situation, that we see something of that, for example, in the dealing with the climate crisis. There's something where you have the feeling it escapes the capacities of the individual, certainly, but also of larger groups like nations. You have the feeling you feel powerless in face of the enormity of the task and what you're supposed to do. And it leaves one with a feeling of helplessness, which I think is very much connected to the notion of trauma, that it renders one helpless. You have the feeling it's too much for you. You cannot grapple with it. You cannot get a hold of it. And this feeling of helplessness is, I think, one that is very much at the center of some of this feeling of uneasiness, anxiety that we feel currently also, that we feel helpless, the crises are just too much, we don't know how to grapple with them.
And it's a defining feature of trauma, exactly what you're saying, this notion of too muchness. Victor, you're a practicing clinician, practicing psychoanalyst. Hannah, you're a historian, but your parents are both practicing psychoanalysts. Freud has come in for some pretty severe rebuke over the last decades. But there is a revival, and if I could do an advertisement for Hannah just for 1 second, she is the founder and part of an editorial collective for a journal called Parapraxis. Parapraxis is the Freudian term for a Freudian slip. It's the technical term for a Freudian slip. Do you sense, is there a renaissance right now of psychoanalysis? Has Freud become part, once again, of our sort of everyday understanding, the tools and concepts that we deploy? Has that rebuke by many, feminists perhaps in the first instance, been somehow rethought or reimagined? Just give us a sense of the state of Freud and psychoanalysis today.
Sure, and thank you for that. I think on the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, the jury is still out. Can you tell I'm a historian? I'm really used to looking at things after 30, 60 years. And I'm like, it's hard to tell. On the one hand, yes, because at least the discourse says so, right? The New York Times, Harper's Magazine have all pointed to a return to Freud. And we can see that there is a great deal of excitement, both about Freudian concepts, metapsychology, et cetera, but also psychoanalysis itself amongst young people in the US. And I think that might be for good reason. When you have, and we've listed just a few elements of collective trauma or possibly traumatizing events on their way already happening, psychoanalysis grew up during a time of total war, of genocide, of fascism. It can address quite a great deal of what is currently taking place. And young people know that, and I think are interested in that, both socially, politically, and also psychologically. And I think the other thing is that the era of cognitive behavioral therapy in the United States and medication has left people feeling like, wait, I know I'm more complicated than that. Give me a theory that honors me by telling me that I am more complicated than that. And I think that is part of where it appeals, the idea of the unconscious. And so yes, for 30 years or more, there's been this war against Freud, but many of his naysayers are dead or, quieter now. And there is this really vital generation of people exploring on the couch and off it what psychoanalysis can do.
I really like your optimism, and I subscribe to everything you were saying. Coming more, I have two things that come to my mind. The one thing is that, more from an academic point of view, it's interesting. Freud is still one, or not, I'm not sure. He used to be the most cited author of the 20th century, taking just Google citation indexes. So he's really very much still alive and kicking also from an academic perspective. But I would want to take up what you were saying about that we have seen waves of the influence of psychoanalysis and the standing of psychoanalysis in society and also in medicine after the heyday in the US in the post-war 50s and 60s, where it was the dominant major force in psychiatry, for example, also in the social sciences. It waned, that it got under attack from behavioralism and the rise of biological psychiatry. It's a bit similar in Europe. Maybe when you think about the student revolution, 68, it was very much en vogue to be involved in psychoanalysis and to think about using psychoanalytic concepts. And then there was a waning of that. But I do see that I'm very involved in teaching, also psychiatrists and practicing psychotherapists, but also medical students. And there is a craving for a more profound understanding of what's going on in their patients. They want to understand what's troubling them. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a very effective therapy. It helps a lot of people, but it leaves some desperate for more understanding of what's going on in them. And I can see that very much in a lot of younger doctors and also in patients.
But Victor, what is missing for you as a psychoanalyst from cognitive behavioral therapy? Is the fundamental missing element the unconscious?
Well, if I had to put it in a word, it would be the unconscious. But it's also about, when we speak about the practice of psychoanalysis, what is very important nowadays is the therapeutic relationship, the transference, countertransference relationship. So that's very much at the center of what psychoanalysis is about, modern psychoanalysis. And this engagement in a very intense relational work is what's at stake in analytic work, and I'm not saying that's missing, and I don't want to be dismissive of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's very helpful for many patients, but not for all, and there's room for many different therapies, I'd say.
Is it just along these lines, Hannah? Is it fair to say that at some point in the not too distant past, people thought that therapy was itself, whether CBT or other forms of therapy, going to go out of business because of self-help books? Any bookstore that you go to these days is, of course, filled to the rafters with self-help books. But it doesn't seem that the psychoanalytical profession or the psychotherapy profession has in fact gone out of business because of self-help books. What about AI? People are falling in love with their chatbots. People are coming to grips with their own psychological issues, problems, through the use of large language models. Is that, in fact, if not a panacea, is AI a way forward for people contending with psychological distress?
I have too much to say about this. I mean, the first thing is actually to bridge it to the return to Freud question, where I say, but the jury is out. Part of that is that psychoanalysis is still especially in the US, elite rarefied, expensive, talk to my analyst about that, treatment that's really difficult to purchase even in the middle class, right? I'm a professor and it's really difficult to purchase.
Most insurance doesn't cover
And
analysis?
almost no insurance covers it, and that has to do with a longer history of insurance and cognitive behavioral therapy and diagnostic coding and how they go together. So starting in the 1960s, and I write about this in my first book, which is called The Distance Cure, A History of Teletherapy, a lot of people were really interested in two sides of the AI question. In the 1960s is the very beginning of the AI question. On the one hand, you have people like Joseph Weizenbaum, who at MIT is trying to figure out how will people relate to what we would now call a bot. And he housed the bot inside a program called ELIZA. So he named it after a woman, Eliza Doolittle, herself fictional, and got people to talk to the bot. And what he found horrified him, which is that people really, really liked it. They loved talking to the bot. In fact, his secretary, who was one of his research subjects, liked talking to the bot so much that when he came back into his own office, mind you, she screamed at him to get out. Because typically your boss doesn't walk in on your analytic therapy session, and that's for good reason. And so he found that people were so hungry for this kind of set of interrogatives, this kind of non-judgmental care, a place they could put their woes, say, their distress. And on the other hand, people are also like, if we could just use that to batch process patients, we would finally have the amount of care that we need to go around. And both these things, of course, failed. And many of the chatbots today are not that much better than ELIZA, even though it's been 60 years later and LLMs are really different than, you know, the preceding 55 years of programming. But those feelings remain. Right? That people want to be able to be non-judged. They want to have a place to confide. They tell me that this is what the confessor plus judgment used to provide socially, right? Foucault has said that, Freud has said that, and here's the AI bot. But the problem now within LLM is that it also, and Weizenbaum identified this all the way back in '66, wants to keep you talking. So it wants to keep you happy because you're giving it data. And that's what it's after. And we've already seen in the States in the last few months these horrific stories that start off with a kind of quasi-therapy, or what I in my work call an auto-intimacy, a kind of self-intimacy through a machine, that then go disastrously awry, I mean up until and including suicide. And that's where we're currently at with those programs.
Are you a booster of the role of AI in your profession, Victor?
Booster? Actually, maybe starting off, it is fascinating what AI can do, and we at our department we play around with it. We try to use it for research purposes. And actually, a colleague of mine who is more technically prone than I am, he built these AI psychoanalyst bots. There are many of them, but he built like specific ones. You have a Kleinian one, a Lacanian one, and a Freudian one, and it's amazing. It's really amazing what they are able to do. You can feed them dreams, and some of the dream interpretations are really, I mean, they are fascinating in a way. But of course, there are many caveats, you could say, and I'm not worried about us being replaced anytime soon by AI. There's the obvious reasons of privacy and data protection, which is actually a very serious issue, of course, with AI. And if you feed personal information, very very sensitive information into these bots, that's something you need to think about. But I think fundamentally it's connected to what you were saying already. Is in analysis, in effective therapy, you need kind of patients feel at ease. They feel they can confide in them. They find some support maybe in AI bots, but there's a lack of confrontation with something that you don't want to hear. And actually, that's very much at the center of analysis in a way. The analytic endeavor is kind of, in a nutshell, it's always kind of making the unconscious conscious was one of the main things Freud thought analysis was about. And there is reasons why the unconscious is filled with things you don't want to know about yourself, you don't want to think about, things that are split off, repressed. And an AI bot is not going to tell you the things you don't like about yourself. It's not going to confront you with issues that you don't want to face. And I think that's a very important task of real therapeutic work. So,
Can I ask you, Victor, if you could just speak a little bit about the concept of containment. Containment, of course, which in my field of work has a very specific international relations pedigree to it. But how does containment as a concept work in the field of psychoanalysis?
This question leads us a bit back to what we were saying at the beginning about the Unbehagen and the very difficult emotional states that are at stake. Containment was it's a concept that was coined by Wilfred Bion, a famous or an important British analyst who was also an officer in World War I, where he had some kind of familiarization with the military language also. And what containment means is that kind of if there are unbearable or very, very intense affects that the psychoanalysts often use the model of a baby, where you have, it doesn't have to be an actual baby, it can be an infantile state of mind or a baby state of mind, where you have unbearable states of mind, of affect, of hunger, pain, despair, fears of annihilation, that you're going insane, something like that, very unbearable states. And a baby needs a container to be able to make sense of these feelings. It cannot itself grapple with. And that's kind of where the primary object comes into play, be it the mother or the father, but somebody else needs to provide that containment in order to be a receptacle for these unbearable states of mind. And it's this process of exchange between the baby and the primary object, where the primary object provides some containment for these unbearable states, is a very important one, that the baby can reintroject. It reintrojects this capacity. It can make sense of what's going on. And it can lead to dramatic consequences if there is a failure in this containment procedure, you could say.
And you refer here, when speaking about the object, to sort of object relations theory.
Exactly, yeah.
Hannah, my kids both suffered under COVID, as so many children did, in terms of their studies, in terms of their relationships. Both of my kids endured a lot. I'm wondering if you had to counsel me at that moment, in terms of a child contending with a psychological affliction like COVID that was so damaging, what would you have specifically suggested in terms of coming to grips with one's own personal reality, happiness? What might I have done that I didn't do?
You sure you don't want to ask the clinician over here?
I'll start with you.
I mean, the first thing that I think, one reason I like psychoanalytic frames is they're on the side of talking about things. They're kind of anti-denial as a politic. I think that's why, again, psychoanalysis became of intense interest to young people after COVID-19, after the uprisings in 2020, where there was like enough, let's excavate. Today at the Freud Museum, I heard the docent giving a very kind of baby Freud lecture, and he was like, psychoanalysis is like archaeology, which is why Freud was into it. And it has that connotation. So that would be my first counsel, is make sure your kids know they can talk to you. It sounds like they did. And then from there, I think trying to give, were they teens? Yeah, so I do think teens had the hardest time in part because they weren't allowed to differentiate from their families at a key developmental moment where they were supposed to differentiate, and then they couldn't get out of your apartment. Lenny and I are both New Yorkers, so those were really tight spaces for those kids. There's no yard, you know what I mean? And there was a very long-term lockdown in New York and also in California where I now live. And so also trying to give children back autonomy, always, and differentiation and tolerating separation on the parental side, while also just really naming, like, we are in a social, political, medical crisis, and really keeping yourself available for their pain, because then you can be a productive container for them, including when they were uncontained, and tolerating that. I mean, that's what kids need so deeply.
Did you see an uptick, Victor, in patients during the period of COVID-19 or thereafter?
First of all, I want to say I'd come to you as a clinician. I very much liked what you were saying. Actually, well, we did see an increase in patients seeking help, even though it was difficult because there were some severe restrictions also for coming to hospital. So it was a troublesome time also for working. I work in a public hospital, so we had very severe kind of restrictions of what was allowed and what was not. But also there's large amounts of data that especially vulnerable populations like young children, adolescents, they really suffered through the pandemic. We saw an increase in depressive and anxiety disorders, especially in young adults and school children. So there was kind of, it had a very real effect, negative effect on the psychological well-being of especially vulnerable groups, which include also many people suffering from mental health conditions. So that there was another population that was severely affected by the pandemic and by the restrictions that were put in place. And also in general, kind of on a more colloquial level, I can say that I do think there has been an increase in help-seeking behavior. Most of the practices are full. It's kind of, it's really, there is still some sense of kind of people are looking for therapy. It might be connected to an increased sense of loneliness during the pandemic, that they were seeking some company in a way. So there's a variety of reasons for it, but we have seen an increase also in help-seeking behavior. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned loneliness, Victor. Loneliness studies has become quite a popular area of study. Do you find that in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in the United States, at a kind of discursive level, but also an academic level, there's an idea that we're going through a loneliness crisis after, so to speak, the lockdowns, right, with the pandemic still ongoing, and particularly centered on men and young men. And it's often put next to or adjacent to the kind of rise of the right and radicalization to the right amongst young men. And then I heard this story the other day from a psychoanalyst. I was being interviewed about my new book, and she was telling me that all of these teens that she analyzes in a kind of group therapy will say that they don't want to go out anymore. They don't want to go do anything. And she started to ask them about it, and it turned out all their parents were tracking them. And so what the children preferred was to hang out, but hang out online. Because again, that was the place they felt they weren't being surveyed by their parents. Not really, not effectively. The kids have workarounds. And so we were talking again about what loneliness really means. We often say in the US, there's no third space. There's no coffee shop, so to speak, no bowling alley is the classic American example, however embarrassing. But I think it's also, again, it's overdetermined, where there are a number of different behaviors, parenting behaviors, social political behaviors, and the internet that conspire towards quote-unquote loneliness, but it's actually much more complicated than that one word will give us as a state with its cause, I think.
And if we could, just speaking about what's in vogue, and we're going to turn to questions and comments and psychological reflections in just 1 second, but staying about what's in vogue, tell us a little bit, in terms of parapraxis, what kinds of essays, what kinds of ideas are coursing through parapraxis? What's the latest and greatest in the field of psychology and psychoanalysis that we might find here?
And so kind. So Parapraxis is written in a kind of magazine paradigm. So it has arts and cultures and books, but also it's very socially oriented. And yesterday at coffee, Victor and I were talking about how there's a turn once again, a return, not just to Freud, but to a socially minded psychoanalysis that's caused a lot of uproar among psychoanalysts themselves. But it's sort of from that impulse that the magazine arises. So the issue you're holding is on resistance in both senses, the patient who's resistant to being analyzed and resistance as in political uprising. Our next one is on romance, which feels like an improbable and unlovely time to be talking about love, but yet, is very important. And thinking of Asada Shakur, who just passed last week, right? She writes, love is contraband under this current society. So that kind of impulse. And working through all of these social and psychological themes from a whole variety of persuasions. It's multi-tendency, both politically and psychoanalytically, psychologically.
Brilliant. One last thing. Who knows, just raise your hand, where there is a disproportionate number of psychoanalysts in the world? What city has the highest number of psychoanalysts? Desi Gavrilova. Vienna is a fine guess, but it's not the case. Buenos Aires. Desi's husband gets it correct. Buenos Aires. Tell us quickly, because we want to move to Q&A. How did Buenos Aires become the epicenter of psychoanalysis?
Very quickly, that there's an emigration history there that's very much connected to when psychoanalysis begins to encircle the globe. There's social political factors. I will plug an essay on parapraxismagazine.com by Fede Perlmutter, who's from Buenos Aires, who tells the story of how that came to be. But I will say that there is the greatest number per capita of psychoanalysts in Buenos Aires, and that you can buy Lacan on the street like it's US Weekly. And that might be the society for me.
Excellent. Okay. We turn now in our final 14 minutes to Q&A or just comments. Step right up. Young gentleman and then an even younger gentleman. I think in the third row.
You've talked about Unbehagen on edge, and you said that this is something very vague. You can't really point to the reason of the Unbehagen. But I think in the last 2 days, we've spoken a lot about the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room that we're all afraid of the end of democracy, the end of the age of enlightenment, the end of humanism, etc., etc. And I'd be interested in your view, specific view, on today's psychological condition of society, both from a historical point of view and from a psychological point of view. What concretely is this psychological condition of our society? Is it much worse than 10, 20, 30 years ago? Is it as bad as 1930? If it was that bad in 1930, where do we stand today?
Take it away.
You should go clinically.
Okay, I can start with trying to address the elephant in the room. It's something, what I was referring to before when talking about the Unbehagen, that it's something a bit, that it has some notion of fuzziness about it, is actually because it's in the book itself. It's you think he talks about kind of the external world, but in the end, it's what's causing the trouble is the death drive and the problem of destructiveness innate in human nature, and that's what society has to grapple with. So it's a complex in the book. It's a complex relationship between a kind of a difficult external reality and a very difficult internal reality as well, where it's not a clear-cut conflict between society out there and the individual, but it's a conflict inside each and every individual. And that leads to, maybe to the question, I think we all sense this feeling of, I was talking about helplessness, this feeling of kind of apprehension, anxiety of what's going on. And I think there's two possibilities of kind of coping with that. Both of them, I'd say, are not advisable in a way. The one is kind of where you fall into this despair, kind of the melancholic way of kind of feeling crushed by the situation, feeling incapable of doing anything about it, and kind of feeling helpless and in despair, and fall into a melancholic freeze in a way. The other one is the omnipotent way of dealing with these feelings of helplessness, that you feel you go into a state of denial and disavowal, and you kind of you act as though you're immune from all worries, and you can omnipotently find a solution to it. And I think somewhere in between these two states is kind of, I'd say, something what we should try to, or what clinically in analysis, what we try to aim for is arriving at a sense of more integration, where these tendencies of polarization, of splitting and projection can be lowered, where there's more integration again possible in a way, which is very, very difficult and painstaking work in a way. So it's a slow process of finding a more reality-attuned position in a way. That's what I'd say would be what we could hope to achieve, which is not a magical solution, but it's something where you could, I don't know, Freud at one point said you can cure someone of neurotic misery, but you can't take away common unhappiness. And that's what analysis could achieve, is kind of take away the neurotic elements, but then you're better equipped to tackle the difficult reality.
If I could just offer my own 2 Deutschmarks quickly. I cited the other day at a workshop that great soft rock ballad by the Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen, in which it's written, "No future for you, no future for me." I think the psychological affliction of the future being totally foreclosed is profound. When you're living, whether it's enlightenment or benightenment or what have you, I think it's less important than the notion that the future is no more. But okay, we have a question right behind you.
I wanted to ask maybe, or address another elephant in the room. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is mounting evidence that like the mental health of especially youngsters, young people, is declining more or less rapidly since 2012, 13, something like this. There is apparently some kind of knick. And like there are theories about social media and also the rise of smartphones, like smartphones for everyone, if this is connected. And I thought about this too muchness, the term you mentioned. Is this too muchness not also like in the sense of traumatic pictures, traumatic things you always have, like when you go on TikTok and you see dead babies and you do nothing against it, you always will see dead babies the whole time when you go on TikTok, basically. So is this too muchness kind of also, or is like this ability to have a smartphone contributing to this feeling of too muchness?
So I want to join it with what Lenny just said, which is that I do think that whether it's the Sex Pistols or Lee Edelman would be my point of reference, but on No Future, that when you are stuck there, it's really difficult. It's difficult for teenagers who are supposed to be rushing out to greet the future. It's difficult for workers. It's difficult, right, for anyone who feels like the going on being in the Winnicottian sense has been shut off. So there's that, but I think there's also a huge psychic toll to denial, to not facing reality, to disjoining from reality. And so your example of, the absolute travesty of what people are witnessing from as far away from their laps, to quote the poet Jeffrey G. O'Brien, not looking also has a consequence. And in fact, society has largely been on the side of not looking. And so being flooded also has its consequences too, right? That's what you're describing. With this cell phone thing particularly, there are really interesting studies that have always, and I am also a historian of media, there have been panics for over a century about young people and media, but never have they contained the kind of entrainment or algorithmic entrainment that we have now. So I'm worried less about screen time than what's on the screen, not in the sense of the absolute destruction of Palestine, which is what you're referencing, but the fact that you're seeing more and more content that is just what you want. That's the splitting, that's polarization, right? It's only giving to me what I want and not having this kind of conflict, not getting a sort of deeper sense of reality. And then the last thing I'd say about that is it's also about, we see cell phone and we think it's the damn TikTok, but I'm interested again in that story that analyst told me about kids not going to hang out because they don't want their parents following them with their gaze. And I'm like, we have to tell these more complicated stories than it's just the damn phones. Although it's totally also in part the damn phones, not just for kids, but also for me.
Thanks, Hannah. I think we'll take 2 final questions that we'll have time for. Yes, there's one here. Is there an additional one? Yes, down there. So maybe we just have both of those. First over here.
First of all, thank you all so much for the conversation. It was really interesting. I myself, I'm part of the Gen Z, and I think you loosely mentioned that my generation is known to be very tuned in and very open towards therapy in general, but I've loosely observed over the past couple of years that maybe we are too tuned in and we are really overcorrecting to some degree. We're really hyper-focusing on how can we improve ourselves, how can we overcorrect, how can we get better, and how can we fix ourselves to some degree. Do you guys feel like we might over-focus on over-achieving something or getting better instead of just being and existing for a bit?
Excellent. And maybe we'll just take the final question and we'll answer them together. I think it was in the back.
My comment might seem rather anti-intellectual for bringing the level down, but if I've got it right, Putin was at that time so scared of getting COVID that he locked himself away and wrote this essay, which ultimately led to all his feelings about Ukraine and ultimately led to the invasion of Ukraine, if I got it right. So can we blame partly the war on COVID? My second comment or question is something that's always fascinated me, and I would address this to Hannah. I've never understood why in America a psychiatrist is referred to as a shrink. To me, shrink means reduction, means making someone less. Can you please explain where the term came from and why? Thank you.
Okay, that was a provocative way to end this, but Hannah, do you want to take those and then maybe we'll go to you, Victor, on the first.
Shrink, short for head shrinker, racist trope around kind of, and in this case, anti-Semitic trope around the kind of, quack doctor who would quite literally shrink your head as it would be dehydrated. That's where it comes from.
Why is it anti-Semitic?
Most all psychoanalysts when they first came to the US are Jewish, so it becomes pejorative, those shrinks. Of course, like Woody Allen, not that I would celebrate him, but also popularizes it. So it's also a Jewish to Jewish remark. I definitely call my parents, sometimes when I'm mad at them, shrinks. I can't comment on the Putin thing. I'm not a Russianist. I would say, just to end with the question, and I will be looking that up, but the question about have we gone too far with therapy, like this idea of self-improvement, self-betterment. You know, it's so not the way I think about analytic therapy, which of course at some level is about getting better in a really complicated way. But you know, like a Lacanian, and I'm not one, would say, you get rid of one symptom that doesn't serve you to come into another, right? It's not that kind of teleological, I'm gonna become a fully self-actualized person. When I hear that kind of therapy speak in the US, I do hear it as like really, and I'm with you on your critique, neoliberal, and this kind of idea of bettering oneself rather than a really politicized psychoanalysis or psychotherapy that's foreign to the social as well as the individual. Thank you.
Well, I'm also not sure about the Putin story. It does seem to be a bit of a short circuit to me, but I cannot comment on it much further. As to the Gen Z, I'd agree with you what you were saying, and it's also very much opposite of how I experience psychoanalysis. It's actually something where you kind of start to question these ideals of self-optimization and self-improvement, and it's very much about accepting limitations, accepting loss, and accepting kind of refuting these omnipotent ideals. It's actually what I think psychoanalysis is about, and not a way of self-improvement in a way.
Brilliant. Well, this has been a wonderful session. I want to offer a big blagodaria to my great friends Desi Gavrilova and Misha Glenny, who allowed me to set this up with you. This is now the end of the 8th iteration of the Vienna Humanities Festival. Another successful weekend. Thank you all very much.